Morning, everyone. Let us pray. Lord, the God of righteousness and truth, grant to our Queen and her government, to members of the Legislative Assembly, and to all in positions of responsibility, the guidance of your Spirit. May they never lead the province wrongly through love of power, desire to please, or unworthy ideals, but laying aside all private interests and prejudices, keeping in mind the responsibility to seek to improve the condition of all. So may your kingdom come and your name be hallowed. Amen. Please be seated. Orders of the day.
Under government motions, motion number 78, Honourable Mr. Nixon.
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise on behalf of the Government House Leader to move Government Motion 78 on the order paper. It's fairly technical and long, but do you wish me to read it aloud? Okay. Stay tuned. 78A. Be it resolved that the standing orders of the Legislative Assembly, effective February 25th, 2021, be amended. A, in Standing Order 41 by adding the following immediately after Suborder 5.1. 5.2. An amendment to a motion other than a government motion moved after the motion has been moved must A, be approved by Parliamentary Council no later than the Thursday preceding the day the motion is moved, and B, be provided to the mover of the motion no later than 11 a.m. on the day the motion is moved. B, in Standing Order 42, Sub 1, in Suborder 1, by striking out previously explained by the mover, and Sub 2, by adding the following immediately after Suborder 1, 1.1. A member may make a request under Suborder 1 by explaining for a period no longer than 5 minutes the urgent and pressing necessity for the motion. 1.2. Immediately after a request is made under Suborder 1.1, one of the following members may make a statement in response for a period no longer than 5 minutes before the request is put to the Assembly. A member of the official opposition in the case of a request made by a member of the Executive Council or a private member of the Government Caucus. B, a member of the Executive Council in the case of a request made by Sub 1, a member of the official opposition. 2, a member of any other party or group in opposition, or 3, an independent member. Sub C, in Standing Order 74.11, Sub 2, by striking out 8 sitting days and substituting 12 sitting days. D, in Standing Order 78.2, by striking out Suborder 2 and substituting the following. No public hearings may be conducted under Suborder 1 if the bill has already been the subject of public hearings held by a committee after after first reading. B, be it resolved that the amendments set out in this motion come into force on the passage of this motion. Madam Speaker, these are minor proposed changes to the standing orders in order to address certain challenges and limitations that currently exist. I hope there's support for all parties for this motion. Thank you.
Any other speakers to the motion? The Honourable Member for Calgary and McCall.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you to Minister of Energy for reading these detailed standing orders into the record, so I won't be going over them, but I do have an amendment relating to Class C that Minister read into the record, and I will read I have the requisite number of copies of the amendment.
Will be known as Amendment A1. Honourable Member, please proceed.
Member for Calgary McCall to move that Government Motion 78 be amended in Part A by striking out Class C. So what this amendment does, it strikes the section of Government Motion 78 that seeks to extend the time that the private bills and private members' public bills committee would have to report back to Assembly from 8 days to 12 days. And it's my understanding that in conversation with the government, the issue that has been identified, or the issues that have been identified, the proposed Section C of this motion, we don't believe that this is the solution. And we believe that there are other options that are available, and we are willing to work together with the other side to come up with a solution that meets the needs of all parties. And with Section C removed from the Government Motion 78, I don't see any reason why all members of this House are not able to support this. So therefore, I hope that members of the Assembly will support this amendment, and should this amendment be supported, I think we will be able to support the changes that Government Deputy House Leader has identified. Thank you.
Any speakers to the amendment? Amendment A1. Seeing none, I will call the question on Amendment A1 as moved by the Honourable Member for Calgary-McCall. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. So, carried. Thank you. Sorry, I was counting at the same time. Are there any speakers to government motion? Seeing none, would the Honourable Deputy Government House Leader like to close debate?
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I would just note that these are some proposed minor changes to the standing orders to improve the operation here, and I would encourage and hope that the Chamber will support these amendments. Thank you.
Well, members, the Honourable Government House Leader has proposed Government Motion 78. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. So carried.
Committee of the Whole.
Honourable members, I'd like to call Committee of the Whole to order. Committee of the Whole has under consideration Bill 64, the Public Lands Amendment Act 2021. We are on Amendment A1. Are there any members wishing to join debate on the amendment? The Honourable Member for Edmonton Manning.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and it's an honour to rise this morning and talk about public lands, an issue that I think is very important to all Albertans at this point. Specifically, when we look at the fee that is associated within this bill of $90 for Kananaskis. Now, part of the reason why I think this is important and why this amendment is important is the fact that most of the fees that we're seeing this government implement, which is really just another tax on another tax and on another tax, is the fact that we have absolutely no idea where any of this money is going. So, of course, the issue here is that there's zero accountability in this piece of legislation that tells Albertans where the fees that they are having to pay will actually go towards whether general revenue or towards what the government is currently telling us, which is to maintain these parks. Now, it's an easy fix, really, in the fact that at this point, all the government needs to do is accept this amendment, which clearly just speaks to the fact that the government, under this amendment, would say that the minister must, on an annual basis, make publicly available a report on all fees collected under the clause and the manner in which these public monies are spent. Pretty simple, pretty transparent, I would say. Pretty important to Albertans to understand where their fees are going and what they're being used for. We see this being done with all of our with our provincial parks. We see this done in other areas within the government around if a fee is being or taken from Albertans, that it's being put back in a specific way. So this amendment clearly shows Albertans what the $90 fee is and what all of the fees are that are being imposed on Albertans for public land. If the government is actually being honest about what they're using this money for, which is to ensure that staff are being hired, that the parks are being maintained, that the public land is being kept clean, and that if any damage is being done or garbage is being left behind, that it's being cleaned up, then fair enough. But the reality of it is that this bill doesn't do that. This bill does not tell Albertans where these fees are going to go. And in fact, we know and we've seen where this government says that money is going to go one place, and in fact, it just goes back into general revenue. We've seen a few bills actually introduced in this legislature where money is being expected to be paid through fees or taxes. And instead of going directly back to the area that they are being taken from, they're being put into general revenue. So I think this is a pretty common sense amendment. I think the government should seriously consider this, because if they're going to say that they're open and transparent with Albertans, and they're the most transparent government in the history of governments and all the things that all the rhetoric that we continuously hear from this government, then why wouldn't the government make sure that this piece of legislation actually tells Albertans where this money is going? Because as we know, there's an ability for this money to be spent in other places. And of course, the Minister of Environment will say, well, no, I changed my mind, I didn't want to do it. But I mean, we saw an RFP that went out about drones. The RFP was clear. It was to supervise people using public lands. Well, the reality of that was that what the $90 fee was supposed to pay for Albertans to be supervised by drones? Because that could potentially be what it's being used for. I mean, there's nothing in this piece of legislation that prevents the government from making that choice. So again, I think that it's a pretty clear and transparent and open amendment where if the government wants to be honest with Albertans, and if this money is being used for what the government is intending it to be used for, and the government is being honest, then they just accept the amendment. Pretty short and sweet, pretty simplistic. I mean, it's openness, it's transparency, and it's public money. I mean, it's Albertans' money. They're paying the fee, they're being asked by this government to pay a fee, and yet there's no transparency about where that fee is going to go. So I think that it's fair to say that this government should have to come back on an annual basis and say, this is where it went, this is what we used it for, it's working. Maybe we took too much, maybe the fee's too high, maybe we should look at whether or not they would actually think about, well, maybe $90 is too much, maybe we should decrease it. Because, we actually didn't have to spend as much as we thought. Because you know what? Albertans care about their lands. They care about the public spaces. And so all of this assumption about all the damage that's going to be done and all of those things, it actually didn't cost what we thought it was going to cost. So this fee doesn't make sense. I think that that's fair. I think that it's again, openness and transparency. If it starts generating a surplus, and that surplus is going into general revenue, that's a problem. If it is a surplus that is sitting in a separate account that clearly can say, well, this money was put aside to maintain Kananaskis, and there is a surplus, well, then maybe there's some upgrades that can happen to Kananaskis for services or different things like that, because the requirements or the needs that are being, or the initial need that this government says they need this fee for, may not necessarily be the way that we see it going forward in the future. So again, openness and transparency, creating an account and reporting back to Albertans on an annual basis about where the money is going, how it's being spent, whether or not it's all being used, and if there is surpluses or deficits, then I think that's fair. And I think Albertans have a right to know that information. And so with that, I would urge the government to accept this amendment, be open and transparent with Albertans, actually tell them what's going on. I know it might be a first for the government to do that, but it would be a good start. So let's start there today.
Any other speakers to Amendment A1? The Honourable Member for Edmonton Beverly Clareview.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. It's my pleasure to rise today and speak to Amendment A1. I too, no surprise here, will be supporting this amendment. I think, we won't even spend too much time just talking about the fact that this government has, in its short 2 years in office, has raised taxes, has raised fees on insurance, on parks, and essentially is nickel and diming Albertans at every turn. But if the government is going to continue down that path, I think at least the minimum that the government can do is ensure that any fees that are collected go toward a designated fund that in fact will be used to improve our parks. It's rich is probably even an understatement that when the current government was opposition, if ever there was, the tables were turned and our government looked to introduce any kind of fee that went into general revenues, the UCP opposition would light their hair on fire. And so suddenly now, funneling money back into general revenues so that it won't actually be not only tracked, but be applied toward what it was collected for, is something that they fought against over and over again. The outcries were loud. And so now we're in a position, Madam Chair, where there's a bill in front of us, and the opposition has proposed ensuring that at least if there will be fees collected, which again, I'd like to make it very, very clear that I recognize that there is a cost to maintaining our parks. However, Alberta has not charged fees for people to come and use our parks, I don't know, since 1905, probably before, since we were a province. And so the need now, I think the timing of this is problematic in that we're trying to encourage folks from other jurisdictions, other provinces, to spend their travel and tourism dollars here in the province. And instead of encouraging and incentivizing travel and tourism here, this current government is trying to nickel and dime folks to come here. And I appreciate that some may argue, well, it's not that large of a sum. However, for many families, the past year and a half have been extremely difficult. And families would like to travel locally. I think many of them, in large part, because of how challenging it's been financially for them. And this, at a time when we should be incentivizing people to visit our parks and to spend money in our local communities. We're slapping them with fees. The message that we're sending is completely counter to what we should be doing. In fact, I wished this government would look at a proposal and an idea that the Leader of the Opposition put forward as far as travel vouchers. This is something that's implemented in New Brunswick. I know Ontario is looking at bringing in a travel voucher, which would incentivize Alberta families to spend their money here in the province. And what I'm excited about that proposal is that it's a percentage of what they spend on gas, hotels, receipts, restaurants. So every business within the tourism sector will benefit from this. It's not just benefiting one group of businesses. And the fact that it can be used over the period of the year up to $1,000 is no small amount, Madam Chair. What I love about it is that families that may not be able to take bigger blocks of holidays but may want to try a restaurant in a community that they haven't visited before, or run down to Drumheller and you know, stay there for a night and go out to eat, well, they can do that and get money reimbursed. And if later on in the year they have another opportunity for a weekend getaway, that's the kind of innovative thinking and innovative solutions that the government should be implementing. Not slapping fees onto the very people we're trying to encourage to spend money in their own backyard. I mean, Albertans spend $7 billion a year on tourism. $7 billion. Why aren't we looking for ways to capture that here in our own province? This is just giving some Albertans another reason to go to another province for their holidays. I don't think we should be encouraging Albertans to go out of province. I think especially right now, when our local businesses, our local communities are suffering and need this economic stimulus, that we should be doing everything we can to keep them here. And so the amendment that was put forward by my colleague at least puts a collar on where these fees will be collected and funneled to. I think the worst place to collect them and move them to is general revenues. There is zero guarantee that any of these fees will actually be used to improve our parks. And I don't have confidence. I don't have confidence in this government. I mean, you know, from trying to sell off the eastern slopes to a number of different, again, fee hikes that were not in their campaign promises. You know, we've seen the war on doctors during a pandemic, a mishandling of COVID-19. I find it fascinating that economists have put out a number of studies that show that provinces who have done the worst job collaring COVID-19 and getting the pandemic numbers down also have the worst economies. And Alberta is one of them. And so this whole argument that the government has put forward from day one, you know, balancing lives and livelihoods, well, the government screwed up both of them. Yeah. The COVID-19 response has been terrible in this province. And our economy is also doing more poorly than most other jurisdictions. And it's frustrating because restaurateurs, business owners are so tired of half measures. We've been limping along in this province for the past year and a half, and so many businesses have either chosen to keep their doors shut because this opening, closing. I mean, for a government and a party that claims to understand business, they have shown the exact opposite. The biggest killer for business is uncertainty. And the fact that there's been no certainty for businesses over the past year and a half. Now, I know that there's an announcement coming later this morning. I can imagine that it'll have something to do with the economy. But I know from talking to business owners that if this is another grand reopening and in another 3 weeks there's going to be a grand reclosing, that'll be the end of some businesses in this province. What we needed was swift, decisive action to address this pandemic and support our businesses. Over and over again, the opposition's been calling for stronger supports for our businesses because they've been telling us it has not been enough. The fact that there are businesses who have been waiting for supports for months tells me that this government has failed to support the very people that they claim to. And we know, especially when it comes to the tourism sector, that they've been hit the hardest. And so they have been asking for targeted supports from day one. And they've received none. And the amount of support that many businesses have actually qualified for because of the minimal qualification levels have been out of reach for so many businesses. Receiving a couple $1,000s that's supposed to help them for months worth of rent and utilities and inventory hasn't cut it, doesn't cut it. And so time and time again, Madam Chair, the opposition has called for stronger supports for our businesses because we know that small businesses are the lifeblood of this province. And we know that if we want to get our economy back on track, we need to support them. And so a bill that introduces new fees, it's not just counterproductive, it's a disincentive for families to decide to stay and spend their money here in the province. And at least with this amendment that I urge all members to support, it will ensure that whatever fees are collected go into a separate account that'll be tracked, that'll be transparent, that Albertans will know that the fees that they're paying, even though that's what their taxes should be covering and not additional fees, at least they'll know that the dollars that they're spending are going to be reinvested back into improving the very parks that they're using. And so I hope that the government adopts this amendment. In fact, many of its members, its government MLAs, if the shoe was on the other foot, they would be on their feet if we were government saying, you need to amend this piece of legislation to ensure that there is accountability and transparency. And whatever argument or reason the government's going to give as to why this needs to go in general revenues, I don't buy it, and neither do Albertans. If you're going to impose new fees that are going to be designated for a purpose, then put it in legislation. Let's see a line item on the budget that makes it really clear how these fees will be reinvested back into our parks. And so with that, Madam Chair, I encourage all members to support this very reasonable amendment that makes makes a bill that I think is not necessary and is a disincentive for tourism. At least will provide Albertans with a shred of confidence that their dollars will help strengthen the very sector that they would like to support. Thank you.
Any other members wishing to join debate on Amendment A1? The Honourable Member for Edmonton Meadows.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm just going to try to see how does it work. Yeah, I got it. Madam Chair, the Bill 64, the amendment we are discussing, first of all, I just wanted to once again share my views on Bill 64. What does it do if this bill is passed? So if this bill is passed by this House beginning June 1st, 2021, that's about less than a week probably from now, that Albertans will pay a $15 fee in, I just wanted to mention, in the Kananaskis County provincial sites and Bow Valley corridor. So that's where the people will start paying new fees, $15 per vehicle per day, or yearly pass of $90. And if its vehicle is a bit of semi-commercial, it's called, like it's larger than ordinary passenger vehicle. So $22 per day, and yearly pass is $135. And if it's a commercial vehicle, then the fee is $30 per day, and or either has to purchase $180 yearly. So on top of this, this bill does not have any provision where it states the government will not increase the fees after those listed in the bills. So it's not just opening up the new area for the government to enforce a new burden in a way on Albertans in a way of putting up fees to access to the parks in Kananaskis County. And first time in the history since the Alberta was founded, but also it opened the way that similarly they have done in the bill that opened up the path for the government to charge the toll tax on roads. So what we are seeing for the past 2 years and so, somehow this government is fully believe that the ordinary people and everyday Albertans should be responsible for each and everything that has a cost to the government. The government somehow does not probably understand. It looks like what we are seeing, every piece of legislation being discussed in the House. The ordinary Albertans who goes to 9 to 5 to work, or we have discussed the bill where government was so much convinced now the people should not only work 8 hours, probably work 12 hours before they see the legislation striking in that they would be entitled to ask for the overtime. So government is somehow so much indulged into the theory or philosophy that everyday Albertans are living so luxury lives. And they are the only one to come up with, to bear the cost, even a number of things that the government was directly responsible for. The government created $4.7 billion hole to Alberta's budget. They bet over $1 billion in American election. And so on. The dissatisfaction of Albertans, the way the government is the way they are handling the COVID-19 pandemic. And how their double standard has been exposed many times. The government or premier or the executive council saying something and doing another thing. And we also discuss then the other distraction piece of legislation that called Recall Act. So in this such case, what government is doing is basically running away from their promises they made in 2019 and their accountability. So this was not part of the manifesto. This was not part of their promises. What was part of their promises? They will create jobs. And the premier signed the healthcare guarantee. They promised they will provide the funds for the new students coming to the schools. And they failed on all of those. So right now, when the people are going through challenging times, they're falling sick, they have to spend time in isolation, and every single day, the Chief Medical Officer of Alberta announced the new death numbers. They're mourning the deaths of their loved ones. And the Premier, not long ago, has tweeted how important this land and the parks and environments is important for the lives of Albertans, specifically for their mental health. So during this very challenging, unprecedented challenging times, when the House has reconvened yesterday after 2 weeks of shutdown due to health restrictions, and these are the piece of legislation we are discussing in House, and that was the government decided not to spend a single minute on debates or discussions. So when House reconvened, so how we should go forward, move forward to contain the spread of COVID and help Albertans. Instead, they brought this present, this gift for Albertans when we will be getting out of COVID, and you will have new burdens, financial burdens. If you if you're stuck in a house for 3 months, 2 months, you're struggling with your mental health, and if you get out, you need to make sure that you will have extra money in your pocket. Otherwise, you will not be eligible to do so at that time when we have second highest unemployment rate in the country. Over 200,000 people out of jobs, and that is the plan you have for those people. Instead of helping them isolate safely, save their lives, their loved ones, and Albertans. And the government brought forward this bill that the people, they're already struggling between isolating the safety of their families and friends and putting foods on tables or paying for mortgages and their bills. And that is the gift we have for them now. When the House reconvenes after 2 weeks of shutdown due to the health restrictions. This is so unacceptable. On top of this, I just wanted to talk about the accountability as it was bragged in the Bill 52 Recall Act. The government is moving all these funds on the name of they will collect this money and spend for the betterment of those parks, and they're moving all these funds to the general revenue. So what they're trying to do, the hole they have created in Alberta finances, they're trying to force Albertans to pay back for those monies back to the general revenues. So what does this amendment does? We know the government has the majority in the House. The government's going to pass this bill. But this reasonable amendment is doing, if you claim your accountability, if you claim this money is being collected for this specific purpose, that we don't even agree, this is the right time to do it. But if you are doing it, then do so in the way the people can see it. It's the minister's responsibility to come out and show the numbers annually, how you're collecting this money from the people of Alberta and where this money is going. So that will set a matrix, how we come up to the numbers. Are they right numbers? Are they used properly? So what we can do going forward, and we see there is issues, there's more revenue coming in, less being spent on, or less revenue coming in, and the government's finding the new challenges to deal with the issues. So that will actually provide very transparent mechanism. So this amendment, I will once again call very reasonable amendment that in line with the claim the government is making in this bill, that even strengthen that claim if you do so. So I would encourage every member of this House to please support and vote in favor of this amendment. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Any other members wishing to speak to Amendment A1? The Honourable Member for Edmonton, Castle Downs.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I rise this morning to speak to Amendment A1 regarding Bill 64, Public Lands Amendment Act, moved by the Honourable Member from Edmonton Goldbar, that Bill 64, Public Lands Amendment Act 2021 be amended in Section 5 by adding the following. Immediately after the proposed clause, I.1, I.2, despite subsection 2, the manner by which the minister must, on an annual basis, make publicly available a report on all fees collected under subclause I.1 and the manner in which those public monies were expended by the government. Madam Chair, I think that this is a reasonable amendment. This is something that I think Albertans have a right to know. When they are being asked to spend money for a service, when there's a fee affiliated, they have the right to see how that fee is being collected and distributed. And if the government is being honest about how they would like to spend this fee and what the intent of it is, There should be no issue in compiling a report and making it publicly available. We know that when there's public money, that there should be some sort of accountability on how that's being spent. What this piece of legislation is missing, glaringly, is that accountability piece. There's absolutely nothing in this legislation that dictates how the money received from this fee is being spent. There's concerns that it's going to be put into general revenue, and who knows what happens to that money. We saw this happen when they took the casino or lottery funds and put that into general revenue. There was an outcry from community with concerns about how this government spends money. But unfortunately, that had no impact on government and their decision, because we're seeing them do it all over again with fees that they're proposing without any sort of transparency or accountability to where that money is going. When we're talking about fees, I think it's important to remember that there's so many other things that this government has done that is increasing money spent, being required to be spent out of household budgets. When we look at cost of insurance, when we look at cost of utilities, all of these things are, under this government, being ignored. We had put in caps in place to protect consumers, to protect Albertans when it comes to necessities. This government removed those. So now we're seeing the second highest unemployment rate in the country, right here in Alberta. And what is this government's response? We're going to increase fees, or we're going to create fees to access public lands. And then we're not going to tell you how we're spending those fees that are raised. I think when people have a genuine understanding of how the money that they're spending is being spent by government, there might be some acceptance of this fee that's being proposed. But right now, this government is saying, just trust us. And we've seen the record of what that means to Albertans. We've seen this premier just recently talk about Alberta having its best summer in history. So this is a statement that he made. He was quite proud of it. Within a matter of days, there was another lockdown. There was another wave of COVID that this government failed to address. So when we have a government saying things like this, Alberta, this is going to be the best summer in Alberta's history, I think Albertans are having a hard time trusting this government with the statements that they make. He said, best summer in Alberta's history. Well, this piece of legislation, Bill 64, Public Lands Amendment Act, was before this very chamber, talking about increasing fees to accessing public lands. So to me, being able to spend my summer, Albertans being able to spend their summer outside in a refuge, to take a break from perhaps this pandemic and have some sort of normalcy, we're asking that they pay to do things that they shouldn't have to pay for. There's no understanding of what that fee goes to. We don't know that this government is going to do what they say, because we don't have a track record to show that when this government says one thing, they're going to follow through. We do, however, have a track record that they say one thing and do something completely opposite. An example specific to this piece of legislation that they're proposing is their budget came out and they talked about increasing travel and tourism. That was a goal. They wanted to be able to say that Alberta was a travel destination. Makes sense. We'd love to see the plan. Well, their plan is that they're going to charge fees to access public lands. They talked about wanting to increase film and television and make this a destination for film crews to come and film in our beautiful province. But we don't see any sort of exemptions for film crews. So when we have a film crew coming here wanting to film in Alberta, there's hundreds of individuals that accompany that film, the crew, hundreds. So when we put a fee on every single one of those crew members, where is that money going? What is happening? We're trying to attract investment. We're trying to attract some sort of highlighting ability to talk about Alberta, to showcase it on a global platform, but we're going to charge those individuals to come here and film. So when we look at all of that money that's going to be raised, just in one day of a film crew being on site, what's happening to that money? I think if a film crew had an understanding of what was going to happen, that there would be actually clear, transparent information saying your fee went to pay for this. There might be less concern about that fee. There might be some sort of acceptance. But I can tell you, when this is being proposed, when you have a film crew that is considering Alberta, and they see that to access our beautiful public lands, they have a fee, that they don't know where it's going, they might second guess whether or not they want to come to Alberta. BC is beautiful. They can go and film there without having each single member of their crew pay a fee to film a project. All we're asking is to be transparent, to do a report, to report back to Albertans how the money is being spent. This government will stand up and talk about the fee and how wonderful it is and how they're going to take care of the parks and they're going to make sure that garbage is collected and that there's monitoring, that there's bathrooms and all of these wonderful things that make sense. But there's nothing in this legislation that actually holds them accountable to do that. So we propose this amendment to be able to say, great, take the money and show Albertans how it's being spent. Show us where that money is going. What are you actually paying for when you're charging Albertans this fee? We know that there's been an increase in people wanting to get outside, wanting to go and travel, wanting to get away. Could be a quick weekend trip. I've heard from families that they feel that this has been somewhat of an opportunity to explore our province. Some people that have traveled haven't really taken the opportunity to explore Alberta. They've always gone outside of our province. Now is the time, with all of these restrictions, to encourage travel within the province. When you are able to experience the beauty that this province has as a family, it might become an annual thing that you do. How wonderful would it be to have your annual summer vacation spent in the mountains? Or a Christmas right here in our province, instead of traveling to Hawaii, for example, as your annual family tradition. Being able to experience joy and have all of these wonderful things happening right here in our province could create future travel in the province. You make memories. You make these annual trips with your family. We have so many things that Alberta has to offer, and instead of promoting how wonderful it is to travel and tour our province, we're adding fees to that, which is a direct deterrent for families, when perhaps they could go into Saskatchewan or go into BC. It's not just the parks that this government is looking at for income when we're looking at these fees. They're missing the bigger picture. When we have travel in the province, that's local businesses that are being shopped at. That's the ice cream shop in Nanton where people can stop and go in and have some old-fashioned candy, have some great ice cream as they're doing their road trip. I know my family has done that my whole life, from when I was little to now with my children. We've explored our province. There's other ways that travel creates economic impact. And Albertans, we want to encourage staying in the province, traveling here, investing back into our economy, and by adding an additional fee, it could discourage travel within our very own province. It is counterintuitive to exactly what this government said they wanted to do, which is increase travel and tourism. It just simply doesn't make sense. When we propose our amendments, it seems that this government isn't listening. We propose an amendment, and automatically the response is voted down. I think that when we have the government saying how they intend to use the fees, put it in writing. Make it part of this legislation. Make it accountable so that you're actually doing what you say you intend to do. There's broken trust with this government in saying one thing and doing something completely different. If they're being authentic, that they want to use these fees for very specific tasks and very specific things to help ensure that Albertans have a great experience while they're accessing parks, put it in a report. Make sure that it's accountable to the money that they're collecting and how they spend it. It's very simple. Most businesses understand that when you have an income and a spend, that's part of your reporting. It's what you do. Why this government thinks it doesn't have to do that people should just trust them, is mind-blowing to me. You've introduced a fee, yet you haven't introduced a mechanism to report on it. So we're suggesting, through this amendment, that a publicly available report on all fees be made available. It's something that I think it just simply makes sense, Madam Chair. When we look at what this government is saying, that their intention behind this legislation, if they put in this amendment, it just reinforces what they're already saying. We're not asking for something different. We're just asking them to show their work, to show what the money is being spent on, to show how much money is being collected and how it's being spent. It's an accounting practice that isn't a foreign concept. It's something that I believe government should be accountable to, especially when they're asking for this fee in the middle of a pandemic when so many Albertans are struggling financially. So many Albertans are looking for ways that are affordable to be able to have a mental health break, to be able to take their family out and enjoy the province, to enjoy the outdoors. When families are feeling that they're cooped up in the house, they're complying with the guidelines, a nice reprieve is something that shouldn't have a cost affiliated with it. When there's such a high unemployment rate, there's a high stress rate that's happening. We're hearing over and over that people are just fatigued. They're exhausted. And so many say that what helps is getting outside, being out in nature, going kayaking, going hiking, going camping. Those are all things that traditionally have been free to be able to do in certain parts of the province. And now, this government is saying, no, we're going to affiliate a fee, and we're not going to tell you how we're spending it. The other thing that I think would be interesting is we have the minister saying that they're going to continue to look at the user fees. So they're going to continue to look at what fees are in place and perhaps increasing fees in other areas. So a way to assess that would be to have a report to see what the user fees coming in are. Is it adequate? And would it support increasing fees in other areas? But that's not something that this government wants to do. They want to just be able to say, trust us. We need to increase fees. The money coming in doesn't support the money going out to spend for these services. Just trust us. When they're making a decision to increase fees, but have no accountability, and this minister has specifically said that he will continue to look at user fees and potentially increasing fees, based on what? If we have a general understanding of how many fees are coming in, how much money is coming in, and then in turn how much money is going out to support the services that they're saying that they want to support, I think that's easier to understand than trust us. If this government had a good track record on accountability, on transparency, perhaps it could be easier to understand. But all we're asking is a simple accountability. Do a report that talks about all the fees that are being collected and how that money is being spent. I would suggest that every member in this chamber can understand the basic concept of money coming in and how it's being spent. Why there is such a hesitancy to actually put it in writing and have it part of this legislation is somewhat concerning. I would question, where is that money going? I know for myself, my banking, I monitor my spending, I monitor my income. I can clearly show where my money is going. If I need to spend more money in one area, I can do the math and figure it out and adjust. This government isn't open to sharing that banking, that accounting. They just want to increase a fee and not have any accountability to where that money is going. I think when we're looking at this amendment, I'm curious to hear what government has to say about why it should be opposed. This morning, it's been all opposition members standing up, talking about this. If I could predict what's going to happen, government's going to stand up when it comes time to vote, and they're going to vote it down without providing any sort of explanation about why they can't be accountable on their budgeting, why they can't be accountable to Albertans about how the money that they're receiving is being spent. It's really frustrating to stand in here and not have any sort of understanding about why they will not accept this amendment. I would encourage all members to support this amendment, and if you're not going to support it, to talk to us about why you're not going to support it. Because being accountable is something that, in democracy, makes sense. You should be able to say, this is the money we're receiving, this is the money that's going out. Albertans have a right to know how their fees that are being collected is being spent, regardless of whether or not we're in a pandemic. It's something that being accountable makes sense. A government that's saying we will, thank you.
Any other members wishing to speak to Amendment A1? The Honourable Member for Edmonton West Henday.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. It's an honor to rise this morning to speak to the amendment before us, and would thank the member for bringing it forward. I agree with my caucus colleagues that it is an incredibly important amendment before the House right now, and in summary, once again, the amendment that we're looking at would require the government to report how they spend the money raised through the fees that are being proposed in Bill 64, the Public Lands Amendment Act 2021. And I also thank the member who just spoke previous to me, the member from Edmonton Castle Downs. The fact is, many of my caucus colleagues have had the opportunity to speak to this amendment before the House here this morning, and unfortunately we have heard nothing of the sort from the government side, and it's frustrating because once again I believe this is a very important amendment. I think that it would benefit all Albertans to understand how these fees are being collected, or the amount of fees that are being collected, and how they are being spent. Of course, within this legislation, we see no information provided that guarantees, again, that the collected fees would be reinvested in public land management. And it's one thing to continue the discussion around the idea of random camping and these fees for public access to certain areas of our province. Specifically, the majority of these random camping opportunities are occurring in the eastern slopes, as we've brought forward already. But even more concerning is the idea that when questioned in the estimates process from this year, the critic for Environment and Parks had brought forward his concerns at the time with potentially this legislation, or the idea of fees for random camping and many other opportunities where this government seems to be interested in charging fees. And of course, at the time, the Minister of Environment and Parks explained that, and I quote, "Depending on user access and what the numbers are, the Alberta government will continue to look at user fees, including new user fees that I haven't identified today, to be able to make sure that our park system can operate fully." Now, I can appreciate that the minister does not necessarily fully know what his plans are for the future for access fees for potentially parks, potentially other infrastructure opportunities across our province. But the fact is, within this legislation, the government is giving itself the opportunity to essentially write a blank check with no accountability on the other side for Albertans. And so today, once again, we're talking about random camping potentially, but tomorrow we could be talking about changes to user fees for accessing potentially areas of our province where Albertans like to go skiing, for example. And we saw, I believe it was last year, that in the Kananaskis area, the UCP made some major cuts that actually forced that community of skiers to raise almost $300,000 themselves to maintain the trail system that is in that community. And so, again, we have on one hand the government, the UCP government, making cuts to services for all Albertans that support the health and wellness of our community, that support the economic opportunities of Albertans, and so on. And to the extent that these organizations are having to fund these projects themselves, and then on the other hand, this government is asking Albertans to pay more. And again, in this instance, we see one opportunity for the government to charge fees, but I wouldn't put it past them to come up with several more fees for Albertans to pay after Bill 64, the Public Lands Amendment Act, is moved forward, if it does, which based on the UCP majority, I imagine it would, Madam Chair, but we will see. Now, again, the government has argued that Albertans accept these fees on the basis that they would be reinvested into the important infrastructure that they depend on when they do things like random camping or go skiing. But unfortunately, as we've seen in other instances, whether we're talking about the potentially the victim of crime fund, that we have seen legislation passed within this House to remove some of the transparency for those funds, whether we're talking about the $30 million war room that at this point the government states is unfoipable because of the way that they've set up that structure, whether we're talking about the changes that this government made to AISH financing and ensuring that Albertans who have disabilities and are able to access that program, how they are getting their funding. Across the board, Madam Speaker, we can look ministry to ministry and see that this government has no interest in ensuring transparency for Albertans. And it's incredibly frustrating, and I again would say that it is an important reason why we need to move forward with this amendment that would require the government to report on an annual basis how the money is being spent and how that money is being raised. We see some preliminary figures that the government put forward about how much they expect to raise off of this program, and Madam Chair, we're expected to take that at face value, that that's how much is going to be raised. But at the end of the day, Albertans deserve to see what those numbers end up being, and they also deserve to see if that money is actually being reinvested in the communities that are collecting that money, and if not, why. Again, we've heard from members on this side of the House concerns, and of course the government was very quick to renege on that commitment of an RFP for drones to surveillance, excuse me, but to watch over public campers. And I appreciate that they went back on that RFP, because I think Albertans were very concerned with that. But when we talk about programs like that, once again, we need to understand where the money is coming from and if that is in the best interest of Albertans. You know, when we talk about user fees, and we've heard to some extent these concerns brought forward from this side of the House already, but yesterday we heard the member from Edmonton Castle Downs talk about how the government really seems to be trying to silo the fees that we're seeing coming forward from this government, whether we're talking about the insurance cap that this government lifted, whether we're talking about the utility cap that this government lifted, whether we're talking about increases to fishing license fees, or removing services from seniors potentially for dental or glasses. I mean, across the board, we are seeing services go down for Albertans while fees are going up, and in Bill 64, that is no exception. And it's absolutely frustrating, because if these decisions are being made to have Albertans pay more, to invest more in these communities, which they most definitely need, then it should have a paper trail at the end of the day, Madam Chair. We should be able to know how this money is being spent. And so it's incredibly frustrating for me and for all Albertans to, again, see an unwillingness from this government to commit to moving forward with such opportunities. So, Madam Chair, I can appreciate that we've spent some time this morning discussing this amendment and Bill 64 as a whole. I would again ask that the government stand and speak to why, as far as I can tell, they likely won't be supporting this amendment. Tell Albertans why they don't believe that they deserve transparency around how these fees are being collected and how they're being spent. Tell Albertans why you don't believe that you should have that accountability that you would expect of your government if you were not sitting in this legislature. There are so many questions left to be answered. And the questions that we've brought forward as an opposition caucus around the idea of why in the first place the government decided against a dedicated revenue fund, something that we've went on to some extent about. If there were other options explored to ensure that the revenues raised can only go to public lands management, those kinds of concerns would be somewhat addressed by the amendment before the House right now. Maybe they wouldn't be done in the first place, but we could at least see if the government was or wasn't doing it at the end of the year or on an annual basis. So it addresses that concern. The concerns around limitations to what kind of fees the minister could impose. Once again, it's not going to solve all of the issues that we in opposition have raised around the concern around transparency or lack of transparency, but again, at least on an annual basis, we will be able to see whether the government is using those funds as was intended or doing the opposite. So there are many reasons why I support this amendment before the House, that we review these funds on an annual basis. I think that it is to the benefit of all Albertans to support it, and if this government is planning on not supporting it, then I would really encourage them to rise and speak to that fact before we move to a vote on this. So with that, Madam Chair, I imagine we'll have more opportunities to speak on this legislation that is going to cost Albertans potentially hundreds of dollars a year at a time when we should be encouraging them to get out. We've heard from many members, again, about opportunities about travel vouchers that our caucus has put forward, and ensuring that Albertans see that the government is working to support them to get out into nature and not doing the opposite, especially when we talk about the economic opportunities for organizations like Travel Alberta, organizations within our film industry, and and tourism industry and so on. So with that, Madam Chair, I'll take my seat, but I encourage all members to support this amendment. Thank you.
Any other members wishing to speak to Amendment A1? The Honourable Member for Edmonton City Centre.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate the opportunity to speak today to this amendment that basically is just looking for some transparency, an annual report from the government on how they spend the money that is raised through the fees that would be levied under Bill 64. Now, this is important, Madam Speaker, because I think if government wants to maintain respect for the people it serves, respect with the people it serves, if it wants to maintain public buy-in and trust, it must be honest and transparent. Successful policy requires clarity, and it requires trust. You need that public buy-in. Now, I'm going to offer an example, and I'll apologize in advance, Madam Chair. This is a bit of a long walk, but it is moving toward my point specifically on this bill, so I just ask that you bear with me. If we take, for example, what we have seen over the last year with this government's handling of the COVID-19 pandemic, if we look back to the first wave of the pandemic, we pretty much saw Albertans universally pull together in following the public health restrictions. We saw incredible public buy-in. Albertans clearly saw and understood the need that was in front of them, the challenge that we faced together collectively, and they were willing to make sacrifices for the common good. Now, clearly there were some frustrations with some aspects, say how long it took for government to provide some of the things like protections against evictions or some of the supports for businesses or their failure to follow through on their promise of paid sick leave. But that aside, we saw that generally Albertans were with the government in taking the steps that we needed to take. And in so many respects, because of that, we were incredibly successful with containing the coronavirus and minimizing harm. Albertans collectively achieved that. But unfortunately, Madam Speaker, that didn't last. And I think that bears specifically on why this amendment is so important to Bill 64. What we saw, first of all, with the initial economic reopening with this government. What I heard, and I think what my colleagues heard, and I imagine members of government heard from many, many people and businesses, were their frustration with the lack of clarity from government, with a lack of support, with a lack of understanding of what steps they were taking and how much responsibility government downloaded onto businesses and others to figure out very important details. The uncertainty that created. We saw that continue as the government made its announcements about school reopening for the fall. Many questions that were asked by teachers, by school boards, by others, again about costs that were being downloaded onto them without a clear sign of what the benefit that they were going to have as a result of it. A lack of leadership by government, a lack of trust and collaboration, a lack of honesty and transparency. We saw that continue going into the fall as we saw COVID case numbers start to rise slowly, as they do, but making their way up on that exponential curve, and we saw that lack of action from government, a lack of support for schools. We saw the beginnings of the collapse of a contact tracing system as the government again downloaded responsibility, and further erosion of that public buy-in, that public trust. As government continued to deny what everyone could see happening, refused to listen to medical experts that were giving warnings, and indeed at times the Premier and others proceeded with using language that undermined the severity and the reality of the threat we actually faced. We saw the beginnings of concerns around a lack of enforcement, as again the issue of public buy-in began to rise, and we saw that begin to degrade. Folks actively pushing back against those public health measures and no action of any significance being taken. Ultimately, of course, that led to the new public health restrictions that had to be introduced at the beginning of December because the wave was upon us. and washing over our healthcare system, and government was finally forced to act. But even then, I think we had significant public buy-in. People wanted to see things change. So still we had a majority of Albertans who were willing to step up and follow. Sadly, we saw that again undermined as members of government, including a former minister, took the Christmas vacation to go to Hawaii, while other Albertans were here and buckling down and following the public health restrictions, maintaining that buy-in, utterly undermined by actions of the government caucus. And then a premier who tried to duck and hide from it before finally bowing to understandable public pressure and actually taking some action. One of the most significant moments of apology we've probably yet seen from this government, a seemingly at the time very heartfelt commitment to re-earn Albertans' trust. But ultimately, unfortunately, what we saw was that was again undermined as we began to approach the third wave and the variants of concern. And again, this is about public buy-in, which is so essential and important, and why we are looking at this amendment to Bill 64. What we saw again during the third wave is, frankly, just an utter betrayal, marked again by, once again, the dismissal of experts who were warning of precisely what was going to happen, a refusal to listen to businesses about the government's increasingly seemingly political decisions, based on what we later came to see was a severe fracturing of their own caucus, and the impacts that was having on businesses who were trying to figure out, in the midst of all this uncertainty that was generated, how they were going to be able to continue to function. We saw shifting goalposts from the government. We saw, again, the utter collapse of public buy-in as we saw the continued undermining that came from a lack of enforcement. And again, this is about that public buy-in, which is part of why we are bringing forward this amendment to Bill 64. And I'm bringing it around, bringing it home, Madam Chair. We saw it ultimately drove 17 members of the government caucus to rebel and call out their own government. They couldn't even maintain trust amongst themselves, let alone with the public, Madam Chair. To the point that two of them now have been kicked out of that caucus and are now sitting as independents. It led to things getting so far out of control, both in our healthcare system, with record COVID case numbers and hospital and ICU admissions, blatant disregard of public health measures, with thousands of people attending a protest rodeo, severe fractures within the government caucus, that the premier had to shut down this very legislature for 3 weeks to get things back under control. All because this government failed to be honest and transparent with Albertans, to take simple steps early on.
Honourable Member, I hesitate to interrupt, but we're now 8 minutes down this path, and I failed to see the connection to this amendment. So I would ask that you tailor your remarks a little bit more towards the amendment A1 in which we're debating.
Absolutely, Madam Chair. I was just reaching my pivot point, and thank you for your indulgence. All of this because government failed to be honest and transparent with Albertans, to take simple steps to maintain good faith and public trust. So here we have a situation where government, again through Bill 64, is making new demands on Albertans, downloading new costs onto the Alberta public, and is doing so without any clarity or guarantee or anything to show what that benefit is actually going to be to Albertans. And I went through that long list, Madam Chair, to show what happens when government fails to maintain public buy-in, when they fail to demonstrate how the extraordinary demands they are making on Albertans are actually benefiting Albertans. What happens when government fails to be honest, when it is unclear. And I would note even that the report on the first wave of this pandemic, the first wave, has yet to be released to Albertans. And here we are in the midst of the third. So that is why we are bringing forward this amendment. I went through an extensive list of how this government has undermined the trust of Albertans. to demonstrate why Albertans should not be expected to simply trust this government about how it intends to use the money from this new tax on parks. I outlined the many ways in which this government has undermined the public's faith in their good intent. To demonstrate why it is essential that they take maybe just this one simple step here, that if they genuinely intend to make the right and proper use of this new fee that they are putting on the backs of Albertans to access publicly owned lands and parks, that this government could show just a little bit of good faith and simply then provide this report to Albertans, outlining how those dollars have been spent each year. Now, I know that is something to which this government is somewhat allergic. On so many occasions, what they have sought to do is to hide from Albertans precisely what they are doing and how they are spending dollars. As I have frequently referenced, and I think it deserves frequent reference, the embarrassment of this government's energy war room, which they specifically set up in such a way to hide from Albertans how Albertans' dollars are being spent by a former candidate for this government. They have intentionally gone out of the way to make it more difficult, even talking back about the COVID-19 pandemic in the first wave, remembering how they used that as an excuse to short-circuit the budget process and have even less scrutiny on their budget for Albertans. That is the record of this government. Time and again, they have specifically undermined Albertans' trust in their government. That's reflected in the polling numbers. I think that's reflected probably in the correspondence so many of these members are receiving, and I know because I get CC'd on a lot of it. Certainly been reflected in the folks I've talked to living in these members' constituencies and my opportunities to phone over the last few months. So what we are presenting today with this amendment is an opportunity for this government to take a small step towards what they promised back in January and have utterly failed to follow through and deliver on. And that is a commitment to rebuild trust with Albertans, to demonstrate integrity in their work. So if they are going to ask every Calgarian family, regardless of their income level, who wants to access the Kananaskis, to pay as much in an annual fee as they pay to access a whole suite of national parks, they can manage the due diligence of issuing a simple report each year about how those dollars have been used. Now, again, I know this government's record with reports is not a terribly good one. As I said, we're still waiting for the report from the first wave of COVID-19, as we are in the midst of the third. We've just seen this government give another extension, the fourth extension, to the Allen Inquiry, which has also gone $1 million over budget and still has yet to be able to deliver anything of substance to Albertans other than what we saw a few months ago, some absolutely embarrassing documents of climate denial that Albertans also paid for. So here is an opportunity, a simple opportunity, for this government to do something different. Re-earn some trust with Albertans, and boy, Madam Speaker, Madam Chair, they badly need to do that right now. 3 weeks away from this legislature may have given them a break, but I can tell you it has not shifted Albertans' frustration with this government. So here is a clear opportunity today. Take a simple step. Show Albertans that you are willing to be transparent with them about how you intend to use these new dollars, which you are charging them, for access to their parks and public spaces. So it's my hope that we'll see all members of this Assembly take that opportunity and vote in favor of this amendment. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Are there any other members wishing to speak to Amendment A1? The Honourable Member for Edmonton Northwest.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak to this amendment, and, you know, not to value amendments any more or less with their utility and their importance, but certainly I believe that this amendment, A1 to the fee proposal as brought forward by this government, is particularly important, I believe, and I believe so for at least two reasons. The first one being that let's take a step back and realize and remind ourselves in this chamber that this is a radical departure from how provincial parks have been managed and how they have been accessed or able to be accessed by citizens and for individuals and not just Albertans, but, you know, anyone from across the country or visitors from around the world. Introducing quite a significant fee to enter and use a provincial park is unprecedented in the history of this province. And so I can say categorically, Madam Chair, that I do not accept the premise of charging a fee to visit and access and use a provincial park in the first place. We have built these parks, which are quite one of the very most valuable possessions that we have to collect collectively as a province, in order for all of us now and for future generations to enjoy, to help to preserve ecosystems, and in order to recreate ourselves in the broadest possible way. And the notion of bringing forward a user fee to access a provincial park, particularly in an unprecedented situation of a global pandemic where we literally have nowhere else to go to provide that recreation for the vast majority of Albertans, it's categorically almost a slap in the face, I would say, Madam Chair, to suggest at that very same time that we're going to charge a significant user fee for people to access those same provincial parks that we in fact own together collectively and pay for collectively through our taxes as well. The amount of money that you might collect from this user fee is only a fraction of what we spend in total for our park system across the province. And I would venture to say that Albertans, if you were to survey them, would say that that is very much money well spent. Even for people that maybe, you know, have some, trouble with high taxes and, have some ideology around these things, I would venture to say with confidence that people would say to us that money spent on parks, public money spent on parks, is money well spent. Because it's not just the people that use it to go camping or go for a picnic or an afternoon in a park. It's just the very notion that we have those things together is part of our provincial, local community identity and part of our national identity too. And so to put a fence around these places, like Kananaskis, with quite a significant fee, flies in the face of all of those things. And so I want to say very categorically and emphatically that that is, I think, not just my position, but the position of the vast majority of Albertans. Especially during a pandemic, the whole thing, as I say, is a bit of a slap in the face. But more to that, let's look to see where this government has chosen to make a priority and to make cuts to our parks' budgets as well. We've seen significant cuts over these last budgets since this UCP government was formed, and we see a continued deterioration of commitment to protecting these areas. And so when we introduce something like a fee, at the very least, Albertans are entitled to see where that money is being spent and how it's being spent. I know that in Canada, it was a long-standing controversy around national park fees for people to realize that national park fees for the longest time were just going into the general revenues. Again, it puts a barrier for people to be able to access parks, and it limits certain socioeconomic groups from ever being able to access those parks as well. And so Amendment A1, I think, is a very reasonable way to approach this, at least in a slightly more transparent way. And I think, quite frankly, you know, who am I to give free advice to the government, but a way to maybe reestablish some of that credibility that you've burned through, this government has burned through over the last number of months. And so with that, let's vote for this amendment and move forward, and we'll all feel better for it, I'm sure. There you go. Thanks very much.
Any other members wishing to speak to Amendment A1? Seeing none, I will call the question on Amendment A1 as moved by the Honourable Member for Edmonton Ellerslie on behalf of the Honourable Member for Edmonton Goldbar. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. The amendment appears to be defeated. We are back on main bill, Bill 64, in Committee of the Whole. Any members wishing to join debate? The Honourable Member for Calgary-McCall.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Actually, I rise to move another amendment, and I have the requisite number of the copies of the amendment, and once you have that, I will read that into the record.
This will be known as Amendment A2. Honourable Member, please proceed. Note you're moving it on behalf of another member.
So on behalf of my colleague member from Edmonton Goldbar, I move that Bill 64 Public Lands Amendment Act 2021 be amended in Section 5 by striking the proposed clause I.1 and substituting the following. Fees related to the use or occupation of public lands if that use or occupation is for a period not longer than 24 hours. So, Madam Chair, we are in the middle of a pandemic. There are travel restrictions, and most Albertans are also complying with them. And only entertainment, the outing for them is that they be able to go to the parks, go to the public lands, visit outdoors and explore this beautiful province. And I think what this amendment does, that this amendment is asking the government to not implement day use fees on public lands. The Minister of Environment has confirmed in the estimates that they're looking at more fees, and Albertans are concerned about it. We are concerned about it, that this will lead to more and more fees, making it harder for Albertans to access public land, especially now that Albertans cannot travel out of the province. And also, I think my colleagues earlier mentioned that there is an estimate that almost Albertans spend $7 billion on travel and tourism. And we are lucky to have this province and have a beautiful, beautiful landscape, mountain, natural beauty, we should be doing everything to incentivize those Albertans to spend that money or part of that $7 billion money within our province. That will generate economic activity, that will certainly create jobs, that will create revenues for the government, and that will also help us highlight the beauty of this province, the beautiful mountains, natural beauty, forests, parks, and all those things. And instead, what this government is doing, that they are doing everything to make it difficult for Albertans to access these public lands, to access these parks. And this amendment will make sure that at least government is not nickel and diming those Albertans who are just accessing public lands for day use. End of the day, these are public lands that belong to all Albertans. And Albertans do pay taxes, their fair share, to the government. They shouldn't be charged extra to visit their own lands. I think it's a pretty reasonable amendment that will clear this hurdle out of the way and encourage Albertans to visit and access public lands without being charged. That will help Albertans stay within the province and own their own public lands. And I think at a time when Albertans are already struggling and looking to get out, I don't think that government should be charging them any fees. And with that, I urge all members of this House to vote on the side of Albertans, to vote against these day use fees on public lands. Thank you, Madam Chair.
New members wishing to join debate on Amendment A2, the Honourable Member for Edmonton, Beverly, Clareview.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's my privilege to rise and speak to to Amendment A2, which, of course, will at least for those families that are looking to get away to enjoy the public lands that are collectively owned by the people of this province who have used them, have enjoyed them since Alberta became a province. And now for the first time in our history, this government is charging Albertans additional fees to use the very lands that they've used for generations. And I won't say for free, because there is a cost. But as my colleagues have correctly pointed out, Albertans pay taxes. They pay their share of taxes. These are one of the services that Albertans have paid for through other means and are now being charged a fee. Now, I've got to say, Madam Chair, I'm actually quite shocked that the government, who preaches about transparency and accountability, voted down an amendment that would ensure that the fees collected in this bill actually go back to the parks and lands that they were collected for. Shame on you. You know, I'll give credit to previous Conservative governments or previous Conservative opposition members who I hope that they are having a crisis of conscience in that only a couple short years ago, they were vehemently opposed to any type of user fees or fees being collected by government going into general revenue. And now today, yeah, that's no problem. Inducing fees, charging fees for Albertans to recreate on, and then siphoning that back into general revenues. Zero accountability, zero transparency. How will Albertans know that what they've paid will actually go toward improving the very areas that they're enjoying? They won't. They won't. Now, this current amendment at least provides Albertans and Alberta families with the opportunity to enjoy these public spaces without having to pay an additional fee. I think of families that are struggling to make ends meet. I think of families who have been, their budgets have been pushed to the brink because of the impact of COVID-19, and who are in desperate need of a vacation. Their mental health is dependent on it. And this government has just placed a new barrier, a new obstacle in front of these very people to go out and enjoy their own province and spend time outside where they can do it safely. To me, this just is so tone deaf at a time that we're trying to encourage Albertans to be safe, to take care of themselves, to enjoy the beautiful province that we have. And this government, instead of making it easier to travel, instead of encouraging Albertans to stay here, this UCP government is saying, no, don't bother vacationing in Alberta, go to BC, go to Saskatchewan, because these other provinces are not going to charge you to use their provincial parks and their public lands. But here in Alberta, we will. And, you know, it's equally frustrating, and Albertans see that this isn't about the government of Alberta not having the money. The government of Alberta spends $55 billion a year. That's before you borrow. Now, let's keep in mind this current government has run record deficits, including in 2019, before the COVID pandemic hit, this UCP government ran a $12 billion deficit, bigger than any NDP deficit when we were government, pre-COVID. The same year that the province lost 50,000 jobs. And Albertans looked around and scratched their heads and said, what did we get for $67 billion? And Albertans saw not a lot. Very few supports. Very little job growth. In fact, company after company after company took their corporate handout and said, thank you, Alberta. We're going to go create jobs in Newfoundland and Saskatchewan and the US. And that's what they did. The promise of jobs, it was either a farce or a failure, or both. And we look at how other jurisdictions, other provinces have managed this pandemic, and the tools that they are using to encourage tourism. I talked about it briefly earlier this morning, but I think it's worth saying again that the Alberta NDP opposition proposed an innovative solution to encourage tourism through a travel voucher that is based on best practices in other jurisdictions. In fact, the government of New Brunswick has introduced the same. The province of Ontario is doing the same. In fact, the Premier's bestie, Doug Ford, is doing the same, introducing a travel voucher. Yet here in Alberta, this current UCP government would rather punish Albertans than incentivize them to stay here in our province and spend their money here. It's quite shocking, Madam Chair. Now, at least with this amendment, we're taking a misguided idea and at least trying to provide some relief for Alberta families who would like to at least enjoy our public lands on a day trip. Now, I don't want to presuppose the vote, but considering this very government refused to accept an amendment that would provide accountability and transparency, I hope Albertans see very clearly that when this government uses those words, it's lip service. Because there was an easy opportunity to show transparency, show Albertans where these additional fees are going, and the government chose not to. Now, at least this amendment will prevent the government from charging fees for just being on public land. It's a small step to correct a very flawed idea. Earlier, Madam Speaker, I was talking about the government budget and the dollars that are available to government. And when government talks about how the maintenance of public lands cost money, I agree. It does. But the government has decided what is a priority and what isn't. And what isn't gets downloaded onto the backs of hardworking Alberta families. So when the government says we're standing up for Alberta families, no, you're not. You're stepping on Alberta families, not standing up for them. This government has wasted millions of dollars, not just on bad ideas, but ideas that have been damaging to Alberta's reputation. Ideas like the war room. That is an embarrassment in the international community. But I get that the government won't really know that because they closed a handful of the international offices. and reduced Alberta's footprint. So in the very breath that the government talks about trying to encourage investment into the province, your actions do the opposite. You're discouraging investment in the province. You're discouraging tourism in the province. It doesn't make any sense to me. And I haven't even mentioned the failed inquiry that's on its 4th extension. And I'm not sure if we even know how much money has been spent on this inquiry to date. But here we have an opportunity to at least allow these public lands to continue to be accessible to families who are only going for the day. I hope that the government will consider this. This is a minor amendment. Still doesn't fix the transparency piece, so the fees that are collected for people that are staying more than a day goes somewhere. But at least this provides an opportunity. Now, our concern, and it came really in estimates, I believe it was the Minister of Environment and Parks that stated that these fees, or the fees that he originally introduced, were just one fee, and that, yeah, you know what, Albertans can expect more fees to come. It's not just double speak to say on one hand we support lower taxes, and then on the other hand we find all of these sneaky and manipulative ways to charge more, whether through user fees, through insurance, through toll roads. It's actually quite surprising. I think many Albertans would be surprised if they saw a list of how life has been made more expensive under the UCP government in 2 short years. I don't think Albertans and the majority of Albertans are content with this bill. Albertans recognize that it does cost money to maintain our parks, and that as tourism numbers were supposed to go up this summer, we'll see the impact of this bill on families. But we'll see how Albertans feel about, and I believe, is this not the bill that comes into effect June 1st? Yeah, that's also an interesting one, hey? Introduce it less than 2 weeks ago, and don't worry about shocking families who have enjoyed these public spaces for generations to show up and scratch their head and say, wait a minute, what? Now I have to pay for this? Well, I think I've made it pretty clear how disappointed I am in this bill, but also many Albertans who have reached out to our caucus have told us their disapproval of this bill, the spirit of this bill, and the consequences of it. And so I'll encourage members in this chamber to at least support this amendment, which will ensure that day use, families that are using public lands for the day, don't have to pay a new fee, AKA a new tax. Thank you.
Any other members wishing to speak to Amendment A2? The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. At this point, I move that we rise and report progress on Bill 64.
Debate first. Having heard the motion to rise and report progress, all those in favour, please say aye. Any opposed, please say no. So carried. The Honourable Member for Camrose.
Madam Speaker, the Committee of the Whole has had under consideration a certain bill. The committee reports progress on the following bills. Bill 64. Madam Speaker, I wish to table copies of all amendments considered by the Committee of the Whole on the date of the official records of the Assembly.
Does the Assembly concur in the report? All those in favour, please say aye. Any opposed, please say no. So carried.
Under Government Bills and Orders for second reading, Bill 66, Public Health Amendment Act 2021. Adjourned debate on amendment. Mr. Dang.
Any members wishing to join debate? The Honourable Member for Edmonton City Centre.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I appreciate the opportunity to rise and speak to Bill 66, the Public Health Amendment Act. Now, this bill, of course, springs from decisions that this government has made throughout the COVID pandemic that we've been in, I guess, for about 14 months. In particular, the reason we are here and debating this bill, which of course we are currently on an amendment on, acknowledging that, recommending that this bill not be read now, but be read again 6 months from now. The reason that we are even considering this legislation is because of a series of errors on the government's part. An incredible pushback that we saw from the people of Alberta due to this government's failure to consider the impacts of decisions that it was making. We are here to put out a political tire fire, Mr. Speaker. This all began with the introduction of Bill 10. Bill 10 seemed to be a ill-fated bill number in the province of Alberta, for conservative governments at least. Bit of trivia there for, I guess, some of the older hands in the legislature. But Bill 10, brought in last year, had a total of 48 hours of debate in this House. Well, not a full 48 hours, but it was basically in this House over the course of 2 days. And during that time, I, on behalf of the official opposition, raised significant concerns with what this government was attempting to do. That is, to give their ministers unilateral power to create entirely new legislation in the midst of a public health emergency without ever setting foot in the Alberta legislature. A significant step forward, a sweeping power that is not held, to my knowledge, by any other government in Canada. We are here today because the government now is walking that back. Despite the fact that at the time we brought forward a number of amendments to address those issues, to improve this bill, and the government chose to ignore them and dismiss them and instead ram this bill through the legislature. Now, that led, Mr. Speaker, to a significant pushback from many Albertans, and indeed members, many Albertans who were at one time supporters of this government. I know because, again, I was CC'd on an awful lot of those emails. Now, it certainly was an odd confluence of folks for me to be aligned with, Mr. Speaker. Indeed, given that many of those folks have gone on now to, of course, be some of the same folks who are avidly anti-mask or have been pushing against public health restrictions over the last few months, including the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms, who actually launched a court case against this government over the incredible overstep in seizing power that they had taken for themselves. And it's been interesting to watch, Mr. Speaker, how we ended up having then our committee, in which I had the opportunity to participate, where we ended up doing a full review of the act to cover for the fact that the government didn't want to simply just apologize and admit that they had made a mistake. So we had the creation of an entire special committee to try to cover again for the government's mistake and to bring us to this point now where we are essentially repealing what the government insisted was absolutely necessary just about a year ago. And at that committee, continuing to, I guess, look for opportunities for the government to try to quiet things down with a section of their base that they feel that they need to maintain. Again, a government that's been focused largely on its own political issues over the greater good of the province, indeed the public health of Alberta. As we've seen again, as many of these individuals over the last few months, who also rightfully were against Bill 10, but unfortunately are mistaken on many other aspects of what is actually constitutional, have been pushing back against public health restrictions and have been met with next to no or very little enforcement until just recently, over the last 3 weeks, when we finally saw some significant action taking place as this government began to realize just how much political damage they had done to themselves in allowing this third wave to again get out of control, put us in a position where Alberta was the worst jurisdiction in North America for COVID case numbers. And Albertans were rightfully getting incredibly frustrated with things like thousands of people showing up at the anti-lockdown rodeo with seemingly no response from government. A government that claimed they could do nothing to actually encourage enforcement, though suddenly that seemed to change over the last 3 weeks when we saw a sudden pivot. And certainly, at least as reported in the Western Standard, apparently the health minister even saying that he had directed enforcement. According to that publication, of course, I wasn't there in that room. But certainly we have seen a marked difference since this government felt the need to retreat from this legislature and hide from Albertans for 3 weeks. So what we have here is this government, again, trying to deal with the political impacts of its own poor decisions, of its choice to rashly push forward with policy that it had not fully thought through. So we have on the floor in front of us right now a hoist saying that this bill should be held for 6 months. Now you might ask why. I guess we would be asking to hoist a bill with which I have just spent several minutes saying I agree with some of the major tenets. Well, Mr. Speaker, the fact is we find ourselves now in the midst of a third wave, during which we have seen unprecedented impacts on our province. Record numbers in our ICUs. Record numbers of hospitalizations, record numbers of Albertans infected, far younger generations being infected. and potentially facing serious, if not debilitating, 1/3 of them, as much as 1/3 of them, facing that from long COVID, long-term consequences that we do not yet fully understand. I'd have to say perhaps there are still some opportunities for what we can learn from this. Perhaps this is not the time to complete these changes to the Public Health Act until we've had an opportunity for a full understanding of what has proven to be the worst of the 3 waves we've experienced as a province so far. This government has not declared another public health emergency, so the powers that they have given themselves through Bill 10, and which are appropriately being rescinded through this legislation, are not in fact in effect currently. So we have an opportunity, I think, to take a moment for sober second thought and ensure we got it right. Now, indeed, there are many aspects of this legislation that were considered at that committee, and indeed, we made a number of recommendations which are contained in the minority report, Appendix A of the report from the committee, outlining our concerns with or suggestions for other areas in which the Public Health Act could be improved. Because, well, Mr. Speaker, while this was done, again, to put out the government's own political tire fire, which it had started, and its own political issues it had created amongst its base, while that was their reason, certainly as long as we were opening the Public Health Act, there were opportunities to consider and look at other aspects. So we certainly made a number of recommendations, the majority of which were rejected by government members of that committee. There also are remaining questions which have not been fully answered by the government in our debate on this bill. And certainly now with, again, the certainly welcome enforcement that we have finally begun to see against those who were flouting the public health orders, endangering Albertans, and encouraging many, many others to do the same. Indeed, as 17 members of the government caucus themselves undermined those health restrictions, suggested that they were not needed even as case counts reached record numbers, even as their jurisdictions that they themselves represented led the province in per capita COVID case rates, even as some of those rural areas in the province see some of the lowest levels of vaccine uptake. This is a time, I think, when we should be considering carefully the government's proposal in this bill to recover enforcement costs, awarding themselves now the power for an individual or organization who is found in violation of a public health order and fined as a consequence to be subject to significant additional costs. So to bill for all of the costs associated with that enforcement. Now, to be clear, Mr. Speaker, I have no sympathy for the owner of the Whistle Stop Cafe, or for the folks that organized the anti-lockdown rodeo, or frankly, for Grace Life, the leadership at Grace Life Church, and those who have deliberately and flagrantly chosen to flout public health regulations that are there to save lives and protect Albertans. But certainly, I think we want to think carefully about all of the implications that are involved in taking on this new power. Understand fully how this works. So are these costs in addition to the fines that are levied? And how will that impact them? Is that going to be the case for every group that's involved? Is it the cost of police, public health officers, their time, their use of equipment? This is a significant change in approach, and indeed, we want to do our due diligence in ensuring we understand what impacts this will have. Again, I fully support the power of government to enforce, and indeed we heard repeatedly from the Minister of Justice, the Minister of Health, the Premier, that all of the tools that they needed were available to them that there was nothing hindering any of the inspectors or public health officials or our CMP or anyone else from taking action. But we do here have a significant change in that regard, and I think we should fully understand the government's intent. So for that reason, right now, while I certainly do support a number of things that are being done in this bill that frankly should have been done by never having passed Bill 10 in this House last year. That would have been the ideal circumstance. Mr. Speaker, but the government chose not to do that and chose to blunder through this for over a year and take the political damage that they deservedly have as a result. So I think certainly this act is one that is worthy of consideration and certainly needs to be fully debated in this House and perhaps given the opportunity to pass. But with the amendment in front of us right now, I would suggest that perhaps we could consider that 6 months from now, as opposed to immediately. So at this point, it's my hope that all members in this House will support our amendment to give us the opportunity to do that, to consider the other issues that may be at play, and work towards ensuring that we are taking the best steps for all of the people of Alberta. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable members, Standing Order 29-2A is available if anyone has a brief question or comment for the member for Edmonton City Centre. Seeing none, is there anyone else wishing to speak to HA1? The Honourable Member for Edmonton Meadows has risen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my honor to rise in the House and add my comments to the amendment on Bill 66, Public Health Amendment Act 2021. So I will speak in favor of the amendment. I think this is a very reasonable amendment that proposes this bill would not be debated in the House for the next 6 months. The reason by saying this, we had actually similar experience on this bill that in last year when initially these matters were discussed, debated, and passed by the majority of government members under the piece of legislation that called Bill 10. So Bill 10 was widely criticized by Albertans, professionals, researchers, activists, and the opposition as well. The government then definitely failed to read the writings on the wall, but definitely seems they have met with their lessons from it, that before even enacting the law, now we're discussing those same matters again in the Bill 66. The Bill 10 did not even provide reasonable timing for the opposition, to the opposition in this, even in the House, so they could effectively look at it and provide their feedback and arguments and listen to their constituents' concerns and bring them back to the government, but government did not listen. One of the concerning part of that bill was unprecedented authoritarian powers handing to the individual executive council member the Ministry of Health. So it was warned by the opposition. It's not damaging the democratic process of our province, but it is also opening very wrong path for the future. Soon after, we have seen that the minister's controversies, arrogance, fighting with doctors, even in such a case where minister just literally went to doctor's house to fight with him personally on his different perspective and different views on such issues the way this government wanted to handle. So to date, the doctors are still waiting for the respectful dialogue and their agreement to be signed. And they have totally lost trust in this government, and specifically in the Ministry of Health. So government listened to it. I think they saw the mirror, but still did not learn the lessons they should have. So we are glad they saw this in the mirror, that the amendments that opposition were trying to propose to address Albertans' minimum concerns with regards to the Bill 10. They brought it a new way into this bill to help see doing what I say, the trying to control the damage that have damaged their reputation, the way they're trying to run the operations and failing Albertans of every step of the way. So it's a bit of a relief, at least. They can see within a year that the Albertans are not going to accept the authoritarian behavior that was portrayed by Bill 10 a year ago by this UCP government. What the issue with this bill is, they are not completely understanding the number of matters that this bill is proposing. They are very unclear. When Albertans are facing health restrictions and doing every possible thing to contain the spread of the virus and to save the lives of their loved ones, their families. And government has failed to address those very issues, basically, the Albertans facing right now. They're out of jobs. The people need help, people falling sick. They are struggling to choose between putting food on table and between isolating themselves to save their lives or save their families, save their children's. And the people, they're worried and they're struggling between providing the child care to their kids. So a number of those issues. So the government lacked clarity during this whole challenging time since the beginning of 2020, once we got into the public health orders since March 2020. The Premier specifically showed continuous lack of clarity in his statements, said one thing, bragged about one thing, and ended up doing another that jeopardized the safety of Albertans, not only the safety and viability, but also put the greater risk on our economic recovery as well. That posed greater risk to everyday working people, small-scale businesses, and the changes in this bill are also related to the issues that this government was unable to address, and this bill is showing the continued behavior of this government on the same pattern. This relates to, this bill proposed actually the government will be able to recover the damages, the enforcement costs from individuals and organizations who's found in violation of public health orders and is fined as consequences of breaking the law or not following the AHS orders. The government has not been clear on this, first of all, day one. The Premier said this pandemic is not dangerous as the influenza. Try to send a wrong message, confusing message to Albertans. And before that, they said the opioid health crisis is actually more serious than the challenge we are facing of the COVID-19 spread. Another confusing message to Albertans. So government kept confusing people. They failed to send one clear message the Albertans could follow, and probably the many lives of Albertans would have been saved. Opposition did propose initially in Bill 10 that not to hand these authoritarian powers to an individual. Don't look at that if you're so much convinced within the ability of your own minister that even the majority of Albertans show they do not trust the minister anymore. But look at the patterns you are setting up. Look at the directions you are going in. You are basically damaging the very democratic process. That the one person should not be able to make decisions single-handedly. That is how the government of Alberta and the health ministry tried to ignore the information, the research-based, the fact-based information from the doctors, scientists on the COVID-19 virus and its danger is to the general public, and try to confuse Albertans under the name of the Chief Alberta Health Officer, that every announcement government was making, that is based on the recommendations of the Chief Medical Officer of Alberta. And when Albertans spoke up, the opposition repeatedly called the government on this to disclose the information. The Premier said that that was their political decisions. So there's a lot of confusions in this Bill 66. It's still not addressed all those concerns the Albertans showed in Bill 10. And I say this is very reasonable time to support the reasonable amendment to not to discuss and debate this bill for another 6 months. Let's go back to the stakeholders and go do a thorough work before we discuss and debate this bill in the House. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member, Standing Order 29-2A is available if anyone has a brief question or comment for the member. Seeing none, is there anyone else wishing to speak to the amendment? The Honourable Member for Edmonton, Castle Downs. Van Dyke.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure to rise this morning to speak to the amendment for Bill 66, the Public Health Amendment Act 2021. I have to say that generally, we are in support of this piece of legislation in the fact that it reverses Bill 10's power grab. However, there's still some outstanding questions that I think need to be addressed. And I think by supporting this amendment, by having it not read and brought back in 6 months, it gives government an opportunity to address some of those questions that are outstanding. We saw that a committee was put together to talk about public health. We saw that recommendations were made. And now we see this piece of legislation that doesn't address those recommendations. That has this new recommendation that adds to the ability to retain money above and beyond the fines that are affiliated with a breach of the COVID restrictions. So when this is being proposed, I'm curious what the thought process behind it is, how this came to be the solution for what I would hope would be to reduce COVID. I would hope that the intention behind this piece of legislation of increasing the ability to recoup cost would be because they believe, government believes, that this would actually impact violations of the restrictions that are in place. However, I have questions about that. I haven't heard from government talking about the barriers that are in place that are perhaps impacting those individuals that want to comply, but can't. That's something that I think really needs to be explored, because when we're talking about COVID and we're talking about the things that people need to do to stay safe, not just themselves, but to keep others safe, there is a huge movement of people that are protesting wearing of masks, that are protesting the restrictions involved with public gatherings, whether it's indoor at a house party or whether it's outside. We hear stories all across the province where people are outwardly expressing frustration and defying the regulations that are in place. And they're very vocal about it. They're very intentional. They advertise. We saw it happen with the rodeo, where people said, like, let's come together and support each other in defying the public health regulations. Why? I'm curious if this government has done any sort of assessment about what's prompting these behaviors, these outward rebellions. I can guess that some of it is directly because of government opposing some of these regulations. We've seen open letters from members of government saying how the restrictions are ridiculous, that there needs to be less intrusive measures put in place. So when you have a government that is on one hand saying, please comply, please be safe, yet their own members are in opposition of that, what kind of message does that send to Albertans? Well, we're seeing it. There's a rally happening today here at the legislature to oppose the health restrictions. That's happening because this government can't even support their own recommendations. We see members that are openly opposed. We've seen members openly question whether COVID is a real thing, whether masks actually help or not. We've seen a government that has been confusing the message. It hasn't been clear, it hasn't been consistent. There's no way to determine what government is going to do when it comes to restrictions. Are schools open? Are schools closed? They deny the science about transmission, blame Albertans for not complying, but then can't be clear with what the measures are. We've heard from so many across this province talk about wanting to be part of the solution. They want to be at the table. They want to help. But they're being ignored. Is the solution bringing in the ability for government to impose further cost onto Albertans? I don't know. I don't know if that's something that would be effective. We think time is needed to actually assess that. When the outcome is healthy Albertans getting back to some sort of normalcy, is this a solution? I think time is needed to really look at what the recommendations were from the committee, to get some of those players at the table to talk about what the solutions are. What are the barriers to those that are having difficulty in being compliant? Is it a sense of entitlement? Is it a sense of being frustrated? We don't have those answers because I haven't heard from government that that's being asked. When there is defiance, outward defiance of the public health regulations, is anyone talking to those individuals that are organizing these things, that are attending those things, saying, what can we do to support you? What are the barriers in place that you need removed so that we can all be compliant with the health recommendations? I know that some of the suggestions that I've heard is that there's organizations across the province that want to be able to provide their services, but they're unclear about what the regulations are. They have nowhere to go that clearly identifies what is being asked of them, what their requirements are, and they're not being listened to about what some of the solutions could be to implement their activities in a healthy, safe way. They reach out to BizConnect to find out what kind of services are available, what sort of restrictions, and they're not getting responses. Or they're getting a letter that says, don't worry, by July, we're going to have limited capacity increased so that more people can gather, and by August, should be good. That's a concern. when we're giving these messages to organizations and to Albertans about what the projected plan is, but not seeing any sort of plan that would support that reopening. It's very confusing for people that are trying to be compliant, but don't know the rules. I have so many individuals in the community reaching out saying, how do we access this information? We can refer them to the website, we can refer them to BizConnect, to reach out to the ministries to find out, if we do this, are we in breach? What are the expectations? But people aren't getting responses. They don't know. So some of these, I am concerned, could be well-intentioned people that are authentically trying to be compliant, but it wasn't clear. So now they're at risk of being in breach, being fined. And what does that look like? We know that there's precautions that are put in place where perhaps a public health inspector would come out and try and educate. If there's been a report that someone is not in compliance, they come out and they try to educate about what they need to do to fix that. Is there a fee associated with that education component? Does this piece of legislation give the government the ability to fine that establishment or individual or organization for simply coming out to talk and educate? Or is it only if there is a fine actually given that those other fees are increased and calculated? I think that when we're looking at barriers, we're seeing so many things that are happening in this province. There's many that are compliant. There are many people out there that are eager to get the vaccine, have already been vaccinated, or have a plan to get themselves and their family members vaccinated. But we're hearing from communities that there's solutions that they see that could increase those vaccination rates. We have organizations like a mosque that says, let's run a vaccine center out of here. Our community naturally comes here. They trust us. It's provided in their own language. We want to help. Are these things being considered? Is the government considering ways to remove barriers that give people access to the health care, the vaccinations that they need? I'm hearing from communities that they have so many solutions that could help eliminate some of these barriers that are causing infractions, that are causing health and safety. But I'm not seeing them being listened to. They're telling us that they're desperate to be part of the solution, but they're not being consulted with. Instead, government comes up with the Public Health Amendment Act that gives the ability for government to impose more fines. I don't understand why this government wants to hurry this through. There's already fines in place. It's very clear if you're in breach what the fine is. But having these add-ons, where does this come from? Who is consulted with? Is this really going to be a deterrent? If you were to ask the hosts of the rodeo, would this be a deterrent? We don't know because it wasn't asked. We have so many Albertans that are fearful, they're afraid, and so many that are desperate for a solution. So many that need to see that support that's being offered. Our government proposed yesterday at an emergency debate on the ability to have paid sick leave for Albertans. That is a solution to help those be compliant. Some people feel that they can't miss a day of work because they're not compensated. And so they go to work and they expose their peers, their colleagues, their coworkers. When we're talking about real, genuine ways to reduce the spread of COVID, to get our economy back and running, those questions need to be asked. What could government do to support that? And I think that by supporting this amendment that we've put forward gives government that opportunity to have those discussions, to answer some of those questions, to look at what's going on in Alberta that's preventing people from wanting to be compliant. We're not talking about what the issue is. We're talking about what we think a solution is fining. And we've seen over years our government reduced some of those fines when it comes to, let's say, issuing warrants for someone that didn't pay a bus ticket. Well, when you look at why that person didn't pay a bus ticket, there's so many other barriers in place. But adding a fine to that isn't the solution. So by delaying this bill, we're not saying we're opposing it. We are so appreciative that a lot of the Bill 10 power grabs was reversed in this piece of legislation. But more thought and more insight is needed. We need more consultation. We need answers to the many questions that people have about what this actually is going to do. There needs to be other ways to help deter. And until we can fully understand what is causing the hesitancy or the outright defiance, I don't know that this is the solution. And I think by delaying it and to doing some more research and understanding about what's happening for those Albertans is really important. I know that the number one resource for helping people understand the importance of stopping the spread. Thank you.
Standing Order 29-2A is available if anyone has a brief question or a comment. Seeing none, I am the honourable member for Edmonton West Henday on the amendment.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to the amendment that is before us. That this legislation not now be read a second time and that we review it in 6 months. Now, I have appreciated the comments that we've heard this morning and specifically around the concerns about well, first of all, the dramatic power that this government and this minister in particular has tried to previously give themselves through Bill 10. And of course, secondly, as we've heard much discussion about this morning, the importance of clear direction and clear public communication when it comes to protecting Albertans, when it comes to informing them, educating them in the midst of this global pandemic. And you know, what we've seen in Bill 66 compared to what was originally presented to us in Bill 10 is drastically different. And as members on this side have said, we can appreciate the changes that we're seeing here, again, specifically around what was previously a drastic power given to the minister. Unfortunately, as we review what we have before us in Bill 66 and the opportunities that had been before us through the Select Special Public Health Act Review Committee. Of course, that was as a result of Government Motion 23 previously. And this, just like Bill 66, was a direct response to the public outcry from Bill 10. And it was easy to see from the discussions that happened on the arrival of Bill 10 to the committee meetings that were taking place that these changes in this process and the decision to strike this committee was completely political in nature. It wasn't about supporting the wishes or I guess the best wishes of Albertans. And as we look through that process, and as we see in the minority report that was put forward by the opposition caucus at the end of that process, I would call a very undemocratic process, we see at that time, and for the record, Mr. Speaker, that when we put forward recommendations to reverse Bill 10, especially the powers that the minister was giving himself, we saw several UCP MLAs vote against that recommendation, specifically looking at the member from Lethbridge East, the member from Banff Kananaskis, Leduc Beaumont, Spruce Grove Stony Plain, Livingstone McLeod, Vermilion Lloydminster Wainwright, and finally the MLA for Camrose. These were all members who voted against our recommendations to reverse Bill 10. So this government is clearly trying to have it both ways, Mr. Speaker. On one hand, they're saying that Bill 10 was the right decision, and on the other hand, we've seen since then several UCP MLAs come out and speak against many of the recommendations that have put forward, or speak against the public health orders that have been put forward. But it's striking to me that when we look at those MLAs who voted against those recommendations, with just 17 days between then and when a statement came out from the Minister of Health explaining that he had, in fact, given himself too much power and that they need to change course on Bill 10, and now we have Bill 66 before us. So at the beginning of my statement, Mr. Speaker, I commented that one of the best things that we can do is ensure that the public messaging that we're putting out is not confusing, that it's clear, that it's informative, that it's educational. But the fact is, Mr. Speaker, that this government and this minister hasn't even been able to signal to their own members what the direction is through the process of Bill 10 and subsequently Bill 66. So it's very hard to again, take this at face value that all of the proper decisions have been made through that process, when you can see from that minority report and the process of that committee that it was incredibly dysfunctional. The UCP using their majority to cut meetings short, to change directions, especially around the original decision to bring in the chief medical officer, and after that point, to actually come back with another motion to not do that, Mr. Speaker. Again, this committee, this UCP government, does not even know what their own priorities are other than trying to do what's best for them politically. So with that, I would again say thank you to the member for bringing this amendment forward. I hope to see all members support it. And with that, I will take my seat. Thank you.
Honourable members, Standing Order 29-2A is available if anyone has a brief question or comment for the member. Seeing none, is there anyone else wishing to speak to Amendment HA1? Seeing none, I am prepared to call the question. Honourable members, on the amendment as proposed by the Honourable Member for Edmonton McClung, all those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. In my opinion, the noes have it. That motion is defeated. Honourable members, I am required to place all necessary questions before the Assembly for the disposal of second reading of Bill 66, Public Health Amendment Act 2022. Having heard the motion as proposed by the Honourable the Minister of Health, for second reading of Bill 66, Public Health Amendment Act 2021. All those in favor of the motion for second reading, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. In my opinion, the ayes have it. That motion is carried and so ordered.
Bill 66, Public Health Amendment Act 2021 is now read a second time.
The Honourable Deputy Government House Leader.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move that the Assembly be adjourned until 1:30 p.m. this afternoon.
Having heard the motion as proposed by the Deputy Government House Leader to adjourn the Assembly until today at 1:30 p.m., all those in favour, please say aye. Any opposed, please say no. In my opinion, the ayes have it. That motion is carried and so ordered. The House stands adjourned until 1:30 p.m.